Hello and welcome to our first lesson on how to deal with document-based questions. In this course, we're going to look at different documents, and one of the questions that we'll have to answer is whether that document is a primary or a secondary source. So in this lesson, we're going to understand what those are and how to distinguish between primary and secondary sources. So first of all, a source refers to a type of a document that gives you information about a topic or an event in history. So we'll look at some different types of documents, but they can take many different forms. We could be looking at a photograph or a section from a book or a newspaper article, for example, or a quote, and those are all types of documents or sources. Something that you get information from is a source. A primary source is a first-hand original account of a historical event. It's written close to the time in history or right at that time in history. A secondary source is a second-hand account of a historical event. It is one step or more removed from the actual event itself, and it is not written by somebody who was present at that time. A secondary source is usually written after the event by somebody who is interpreting or analyzing a primary source. So in other words, a secondary source talks about a primary source. A primary source, as I mentioned, is an original first-hand account of an event or a time period, and it's documented right at that time or very close to that time in history. It is factual, meaning that it does not analyze or interpret information. It can take different forms, but the key is always that it is an original document or an original artifact or creative work. What are some examples of primary sources? Here's some, and here's some that we'll see in this course. Documents can include a diary written by somebody at that time in history about their experiences. A speech is a primary source. It could be an audio recording of a speech, a video recording of a speech, or a transcribed speech, which is a speech that has been written out word for word. A poster or an advertisement created at a particular time in history is a primary source. A letter written to somebody at that time in history. An interview with somebody who lived during a particular time is a primary source because the person being interviewed was present at that time. The interview could occur directly after an event or many, many years after an event, as long as the person being interviewed can give a first-hand account of their own experience. News film footage. So when we look at the news and we see real footage of something that's just happened, like a earthquake, that would be a primary source. An autobiography is a book that is written by a person about their own life or experiences. And because it's a first-hand account, it's a primary source. Official government records such as an act, the BNA Act, the Indian Act, which we'll study in this course, are primary sources, as well as a marriage certificate, so any official document. A newspaper article that is written at the time of an event or very close to it, and it is factual, meaning it just gives the information and it doesn't attempt to analyze or interpret information, so it's not a biased account. That would be considered a primary source. We'll talk a little more about newspaper articles in a moment. Photographs and postcards are primary sources if they were taken at the time. Creative works can be primary sources. Poetry, stories, a play, a song, a piece of art such as a drawing or a painting where the artist has created it at the time of the event, those are considered primary sources. Also, relics and artifacts such as pottery, furniture, clothing, for example, are primary sources if they were from a particular time period. Let's look at some examples. Here we have a newspaper article, and my question will be whether it's a primary or secondary source. I have to read the article and look at some information to make that decision. So remember that a primary source is a first-hand account or it's factual and it's written close to or at the time of an event. So this article is about the Chinese workers, Chinese immigrants who were working on the Canadian Pacific Railway in BC during the time of its construction, which was during the 1880s. And I can see here this article was written in 1883. So if I'm studying the CPR, I know that this particular article was written at the time of the event. And if I read through the article, we won't read through it really carefully here, but it's discussing the conditions of Chinese workers on the CPR, how dangerous those conditions were, and how many people were dying during this time. So it's a factual newspaper article at the time of the event, and therefore I consider this to be a primary source. You might have seen this book before, or perhaps you've read it. The Diary of Anne Frank is a book which is essentially diary entries that have been published, and they were written by a young girl named Anne Frank who lived during the World War II Holocaust, and she writes about her experiences. And this book would be considered very much like an autobiography. It's a collection of diary entries, and therefore it would be a primary source. It was written by the person. It's a first-hand account of World War II. Here's an example of a speech that was given in 2008 by Prime Minister Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, and it is an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. This speech has been transcribed. It's written out here, and because it is the actual speech itself, it's a primary source. Notice that if we were to read an article that discussed the speech and talked about it, but it wasn't the speech itself, that would be a secondary source. So now let's look at some secondary sources. Remember that a secondary source is a second-hand account of a historical event. It analyzes or it talks about primary sources. It can also talk about a creative work such as a drawing. Often secondary sources, most of the time, have been created or documented many years after an event or after a particular time period. They're always one or more steps removed from the event. Some examples would include a textbook. Our Horizons textbook is a great example of a secondary source. Sometimes these are called tertiary sources, but for our purposes in Social Studies 10, we're going to look at textbooks as secondary sources. The authors have collected information and they have looked at primary sources, but the information that they're writing, that book is a secondary source. Magazine articles that interpret a primary source, so they talk about something that happened in history, that would be a secondary source, as well as newspaper articles that interpret. So if a newspaper article is written after an event or by somebody who was not present and it is interpreting primary sources, it's interpreting information, it's not factual, then it would be considered a secondary source. Histories, biographies, which are books written about a person by another person, those are secondary sources. Criticisms, commentaries, encyclopedias are all secondary sources. And in the same way that you can analyze a primary source that is a text document, an analysis of a piece of art, such as a film review or a theater review, would be a secondary source. An analysis of a drawing, the drawing would be the primary source, but the analysis of it or the discussion of the drawing would be a secondary source. And let's look at some examples of these. Here we have an excerpt from the book The Great Railway by Pierre Burton. This book is about the experience of Chinese workers on the CPR. Really, the book is about the CPR itself, but here in this excerpt, he's talking about Chinese workers. And the book was written in 1974, so about 100 years after the CPR was constructed. So it was written later, and we know that this person has analyzed primary sources to create their book. So this book itself is a secondary source. Our Horizon textbook, as we discussed, is a secondary source. Here's an excerpt from a Horizon textbook about the Red River Rebellion. And it is a secondary source because it analyzes and it interprets the events. It talks about primary sources. And the authors have collected primary sources in order to write the textbook. But the authors themselves are removed from the actual event. They were not there during the Red River Rebellion. It's a second-hand account. If you're not sure whether something is a primary source or a secondary source, there's a few things you should do. First, you should use these notes. Use the criteria that you're given in this course. Think critically about it. Ask yourselves questions and try to put the source in one category or another. So ask yourself questions like, was the person there at the time of the event? Who is the author? Is it interpreting? Is it interpreting or analyzing an event? Okay, those are questions that you would want to ask. If you're really unsure, you can always ask your teacher for help. And when you do make your decision, whether it's a primary or secondary source, make sure you explain your reasons for your choice. This helps your teacher to understand where you're coming from. And if there's some confusion, it allows your teacher to help you clarify what the difference is between a primary or secondary source. Excellent. Good luck. And you can now watch the second lesson, which talks about other questions that we will need to ask when we deal with document-based questions.